You are standing in the quiet shadow of Topkapi Palace, not far from the barracks where the Janissaries once trained in the orderly rhythm of empire. It's dawn. The stone courtyard is cool and nearly silent, save for the distant rustle of palm leaves and the quiet snort of a tethered horse. That sound, mundane, easily ignored, was once everything to a man named Hillel. Not a sultan, not a vizier, and certainly not a name inscribed on the walls of power. Hillel was a janissary in the late 17th century. His unit number has been forgotten. His rank was middling, but the scribbled poems tucked into the margins of a dusty Ottoman register kept now in an Istanbul archive contain verses about a horse named Surmali. Before the poetry, however, there was discipline taught to understand. Hillel, you must understand the Devshirme system. A boy like Hillel, likely taken from a Christian village in the Balkans, would have been selected at a young age, perhaps 9 or 10. He would not have remembered his native language for long. Trained in Turkish, drilled in religion, tactics, and language, he became an instrument of the empire. But unlike modern militaries, the Janissaries were raised not just to obey, but to become part of a system so deeply rooted that every gesture, every step in formation, had symbolic meaning. Breakfast in the barracks was structured. Lentils, bread, sometimes yogurt. Each pot was shared, and the act of lifting a spoon was coordinated. A janissary who showed too much hunger or pride might be reprimanded, not with shouting, but with silence from his messmates. It was within this rigorously structured world that Hillel began to write. His first entries are brief. A list of feed amounts, a sketch of a horseshoe, possibly copied from a field manual. But then, scattered among account records, come stanzas. You do not speak, yet you carry me farther than my father's arms ever did. Surmali, your silence tells more truths than a muezzin's cry at dusk. Why would a janissary write poetry? To a horse. Perhaps because a janissary could trust few others. Their loyalty was meant for the Sultan alone. They were forbidden to marry, to trade, even to grow beards in earlier centuries. In Halalay's era, many of these restrictions had loosened. But the culture of detachment lingered. Horses, unlike humans, asked nothing but care and consistency. And Surmali, by all accounts, was more than a beast of burden. Notes in the margins suggest she had a rare trait prized by Ottoman cavalry: the ability to run without breaking rhythm across uneven stone. This made her ideal for ceremonial duties, or perhaps for delivering important messages within Istanbul's confusing web of roads. There is no direct record of how Hillel and Surmali were paired. But in one poem he writes, "They gave me a sword I did not name. The pen I broke. The horse I kept." The janissaries were no strangers to boredom. When not deployed, their days were filled with waiting for orders, for parades, for rations, for repairs. Some took to gambling, others to quiet rebellion. Hillel, apparently, took to verse. One wonders whether any of his comrades knew. Was there a small audience of listeners late at night? Did he mutter rhymes while brushing Surmali's mane? Or were these poems written only in the privacy of silence, tucked away with the care of a man who understood they were not meant to be shared? His handwriting is careful, almost too careful, suggesting perhaps that he copied them down after memorizing them first. Some lines are scratched out. Some contain unfamiliar idioms, possibly remnants of his lost mother tongue. If Surmali was a mare of significance, it's possible she accompanied Hillel on more than drills. Some elite janissaries were attached to embassies or ceremonial events. There is one mention of a horse resembling Semele being used during a festival on the Bosphorus. Could Halal have walked beside her in a column of plumed helmets, feet falling in rhythm to the beat of imperial drums? Or was he simply watching from the edge, a nameless man in a uniform, eyes tracking one chestnut flank among hundreds? The Ottomans kept detailed records, but rarely of feelings. There are lists of saddles issued, oats consumed, even names of farriers, but never do they mention what it felt like to watch a horse gallop at sunrise, or how a soldier might whisper a farewell before battle, not to a friend, but to an animal who never broke rank. The fact that we have Halal's poetry at all is a fluke. The register in which they were found was misfiled, under naval inventories, only rediscovered during a digitization project in the 1990s. Scholars noted the presence of ink smudges, suggesting the pages were carried for some time before being archived. Perhaps he kept them hidden. Perhaps they were added posthumously by someone who couldn't bear to throw them away. We do not know how Halalo's story ends. The last entry is dated 1702. A brief note, no poem, mentions Semele being retired to the outer stables. Whether Halal followed her there, or was reassigned, is never made clear. But what does it mean for a man so tightly woven into the machinery of empire to leave behind something so small, so human? A verse, an observation, a love not romantic, but built on hoofbeats and hay. Was he exceptional, or were there dozens like him, quiet, observant, forgotten? And perhaps more curiously, what do a few lines of forgotten verse tell us about the world behind the polished surface of empire? You are now in the shadowed quiet of the Endayun courtyard, the inner school of the palace complex. Stone basins catch the morning light, filled with water still cool from the night. Around the perimeter, apricot trees lean slightly, as if eavesdropping on the lives lived here centuries ago. Stable bells echo faintly from beyond the courtyard in Halal's time. The stables of the Ottoman court were more than places to house animals. They were a universe of routine, hierarchy, and quiet rituals. Horses in the service of the Sultan were registered, groomed, exercised, and even massaged. Their manes were perfumed before ceremonial processions. Grooms learned not just the diet of each horse, but its temperament, its gait, its sleep habits. Halal was not a groom by training, but janissaries often interacted with horses during drills, inspections, and dispatch duty. Those assigned to ceremonial roles might be paired long-term with a specific horse, one whose temperament matched their own. It's here, in this rhythm of care and discipline, that Halal's second voice begins to emerge. If his early poetry was admiring, later verses feel ... confessional. You listened better than men, and forgot better than women. They say I serve a sultan, but Semele, I serve you. In these lines, a strange inversion occurs. The soldier, trained to obey orders without question, expresses a private devotion not to the state or to glory, but to a four-legged companion with no comprehension of the court's politics. This was, in its own way, subversive, but softly so, gently. Like many things in Halal's world, Ottoman military culture was filled with ceremony and symbolism. Every act, tying a sash, mounting a horse, even sharing a bowl of soup, carried layered meanings. For a janissary, loyalty was both literal and performative. They marched as a unit, turned their heads at the same moment, carried swords of the same make. In this sea of sameness, a hidden poem about a specific horse feels startlingly personal. Scholars, have debated whether Halal intended these writings for anyone else. One school suggests they were a meditative practice meant to pass the long hours on guard duty or after parade drills. Another theory proposes that Halal may have been literate beyond the average soldier, trained in Persian poetics or exposed to courtly literature. Indeed, one of his verses borrows a meter commonly used in ghazals, love poems often recited in Sufi gatherings. If I must leave you, leave my sleep behind, so I may walk to you again at dawn. Sleep, to Hala, becomes something porous, a space between himself and the horse, between duty and longing. Yet life in the stables was not romantic. The smell of manure, the sharpness of straw dust in the throat, the stiff aches of early morning saddle checks, these were not poetic. Halal worked, likely in silence, alongside others whose boots tapped the same packed earth floors. The stables near the palace were busy, loud with neighs and the muttered conversations of keepers. But within that world there were moments of stillness, a snort, a warm muzzle pressed into a calloused palm, the ritual of brushing out a coat until it shone like polished wood. The records of the imperial stables from the 1690s include a curious no-tan inventory, discrepancy involving 2 units of rosewater unaccounted for. These perfumes were used sparingly on favored animals before religious holidays or royal ceremonies. Semele may have been one of them. The poet-warrior may have been the one to apply it. They gave you roses, and I gave you water. One vanished, one stayed in your eyes. It's a simple image, and yet it suggests Halal was aware of the dichotomy he inhabited. A soldier among poets, a servant of empire who lavished praise not on a sultan or general, but on a horse whose worth was likely never recorded in official terms. The question of Halal's emotional world is harder to answer. The Ottomans were not unfeeling. Theirs was a culture of subtle emotion, of metaphor and gesture. Public stoicism often masked private melancholy, and among the Janissaries, where men were raised without families, without personal property or wives for much of their service, emotional intimacy often found strange roots. A shared meal, a repeated joke, a horse's familiar nudge against a shoulder. Some modern scholars speculate that the attachment Halal expresses might reflect a deeper loneliness, one that comes not from abandonment but from uniformity. Janissaries were never truly alone, but rarely fully themselves. In writing poetry, Halal may have found the only space where his inner self could exist without contradiction, that he chose to write about Semele, not about victory, not about prayer or politics is telling. Your hooves sounded truer than any drum at Selamai, your breath steadier than any imam's call. His admiration for the horse transcends metaphor. It is not religious, it is not purely aesthetic. It's practical, steady, rooted in the shared bodily experience of drills, of weather, of waiting. Still, not all was calm. In one fragment barely legible, water-stained, he writes, "They say she stumbles. They say I must trade her. I say my legs will forget the ground before hers do." Is this fiction, a metaphor? Or was Semele aging, and with her Hallow's role in courtly life fading? The 1699 records include a brief mention of a janissary reassigned to outer barracks duty. Horse supply, logistics. The handwriting matches Hala's own in the register margins. If this was him, it suggests he remained close to the stables even after leaving parade duties. But nowhere is there mention of Semele's final fate. No burial, no sale, no transfer, only the silence of bureaucratic paper, and Hillel, the final. Lines of his surviving notes contain no names, no references to horses or comrades. Just this: if they ask where I went, say I followed the rhythm that remembered me. There are no heroic deaths in this story, no decisive battles, just the quiet, methodical life of a soldier poet who loved a horse, a man who bent the purpose of military paperwork to include personal lyric. His verses live on, buried not in anthologies, but in cataloguing errors. A poetry filed between saddle rations and hoof-trim reports. And perhaps, in the quiet rhythm of hoofbeats long past, Hillel found something steadier than empire, something that didn't need to last forever, just long enough to be remembered, if only in sleep. The winter rain slicks the stone streets of old Istanbul. You are walking along what was once the ceremonial route between the Janissary barracks and the Sultan's palace. The narrow alleys echo with ghostly steps if you pause long enough. Boots, hooves, and the rattle of standards once lifted in perfect formation. Somewhere in this city, long ago, Hillel walked beside his horse, Sir Melly, for the last time. No one recorded the date of his death. No burial entry lists his name. No tombstone bears his handwriting. But the registry where his words live on quietly, shelved in the Ottoman archives, is more enduring than marble. We return to the documents now, yellowed and brittle. The script is careful, the ink light in places, but something changes in these final pages, where once he wrote poems. Now Hillel copies words from earlier entries, rituals, feeding instructions. They appear not as records, but as memories being rehearsed. As if, knowing his end was near, he chose to preserve the daily rhythms he once lived by. To clean the bridle before prayer. To check the flank for bruises, even when the horse pretends not to mind. This reads less like a list and more like a meditation. At this stage, Hillel may no longer have had a formal position. The stables were increasingly mechanized by bureaucracy, and the older janissaries, especially those without influential patrons, were sometimes pushed into retirement with little ceremony. Some historians speculate he may have taken a minor post as a palace doorkeeper, or even become a caretaker in the imperial library. He would not have been the first soldier to fade into the quiet alcoves of administration. But it is a short, almost invisible line near the back of the register that gives us a final glimpse, Semeli removed from active detail. Outer stalls, groom note, limping, gentle. She was old, perhaps injured. Horses in the palace stables were often retired to quieter service use to train new grooms, or simply kept in peace if their temperaments allowed. And the word gentle added at the end in an unusually soft hand matches the same flourished script Hillel used for his poetry. It's the last confirmed trace of either of them was Hillel with her. Did he spend his final days brushing her mane, feeding her oats softened with warm water? Did he walk beside her, not in uniform, but in the clothes of an old soldier? A fading hoofprint beside a fading man. There is one final poem undated, unregistered, and nearly missed by researchers. It was scribbled inside the back cover of the registry, where a catalogue number would later be stamped over it. But through ultraviolet scanning, the words emerged again. Let them remember drums, not dust. I remember the pause before her foot fell. A line like that isn't grand. It isn't fit for monument or anthem, but it captures something rare. The beauty of the small moment, the in-between step, the very thing most history forgets. We are not told whether Hillel was lonely. We do not know if he feared death or felt peace. But the act of writing these lines, knowing they might never be read, suggests he still believed in something. Not in glory, not in war, but in rhythm, in the sound of hoofbeats across a courtyard. Before dawn, in the quiet bond between a soldier and the only companion who never asked him to explain himself. We end where we began, at the edge of memory, with a man whose name was nearly lost, and a horse who never spoke but once carried an empire's rhythms in her steady, steady steps. Sleep now, with Hallow's world beside you. Let the hoofbeats slow. Let the page close gently. Before the city wakes, before the fishermen pull in their lines or the scribes open their shutters. You are already high above Alexandria. It's the 2nd century BCE. The sea smells different, here sharper as it crashes against the curved harbor walls. The Pharos of Alexandria towers behind you, white against the haze, its tiers rising like stacked citadels. You are standing where few ever do, on the service platform at the lighthouse's middle level, and you are not alone. A man named Cleon is sweeping the dew from marble steps with a bundle of palm fibers bound by worn linen cord. His robe is short, work-hemmed, his hair is graying, and in his left hand he holds a wax tablet covered in smudged symbols, a record of wind direction, timidity, gull migrations. He is a lighthouse keeper, but Cleon is not the kind of figure legends remember. He didn't invent a lever or argue with philosophers. He did not write a treatise on optics or geometry. Instead, every morning before sunrise, he climbs the interior spiral of the lighthouse up nearly 300 feet of polished ramps and sun air to record the shape of the morning clouds, because someone has to. Alexandria's Pharos isn't just a beacon for ships. It's a quiet archive of wind and weather, of tides and warnings, beneath the flame that burns through the night. A smaller tradition smolders one of notes passed from keeper to keeper, and Cleon's job is to maintain it. He begins each day by standing on the middle platform and writing with a small stylus. On his wax tablet, his handwriting is narrow, tidy. He notes the number of gulls wheeling over the harbor, the direction of their flight, and whether they cry or fall silent. This is not superstition. In ancient Alexandria, seabirds were earth systems, their absence sometimes foretold desert winds. Their sudden descent could hint at pressure shifts, or a storm hiding beyond the horizon. Today, Cleon notes, 5 gulls circling, low path, no call, air warm, sea unusually calm. Then he descends to feed the night watch tortoise. Yes, the tortoise. Every lighthouse keeper at the Pharos keeps a small tortoise to mark the start and end of each shift. The story goes that the creature's hunger and movement help the keeper remember to rotate sleeping patterns and track the long hours between sun and fog. Cleon's tortoise is named Limos Greek for hunger, and it is older than most junior. Guards posted to the outer docks. He offers limos to leaves of mulberry and some cucumber peel. The tortoise turns its head slowly, blinking as if remembering a dream from last week. The routine is unchanged, and that is the point. For all its marble grandeur, the lighthouse is a machine built of people and habits. The flame that tops the tower must be tended every night. Copper reflectors must be polished. The cisterns must be checked for seepage. The shutters must be tested before noon, so they don't warp in the heat. Cleon records all of this, but not in a scroll. He keeps a narrow shelf of wax tablets, each marked with the date using a rotating system of notches. At the end of each 10-day cycle, he smooths the wax, rewrites the observations onto a papyrus sheet, and passes it to the dock clerk. Most of these reports are never read again. Some are lost to mold or to poor filing. Others, surprisingly, survive wedged into bundles of naval inventory or temple duty rosters. One scroll, now held in a museum in Cairo, reads, "Morning fog, 3 days. Sea calm. Pollen from south likely. Acacia bloom in Memphis. Limos did not eat." That's it. Not dramatic, not poetic, but it tells us something. Cleon was watching, even when nothing seemed worth seeing. And yet this was Alexandria, a city where watching was a kind of science. The great library stood not far from the pharaohs. Cleon had never been inside, but he had met scribes who passed through the harbor, dusty and sunburnt, sent to collect plant specimens or weather data. Once, one of them offered to copy Cleon's wind notations, saying they might help future study of coastal rhythms. Cleon nodded, then forgot the man's name. But the idea stayed. So he began copying 2 versions of his reports, one for the dock, and one he left in the lighthouse itself, in a small wooden drawer beneath the guard bench. He stashed 30 or so rolled papyri, tied with blue twine, each labeled with a date and a short phrase. Day of sand gusts. Sea smelled like olives. No gulls, no wind. Strange stillness. They weren't scientific in the way modern minds might prefer, but they were steady, gentle, patient. He did not aim for discovery, only for continuity. Sometimes a junior keeper would scoff at the notes. Why bother with scribbles when the sea will do as it pleases? Cleon would shrug gently. We write to remember the patterns, not to control them. At dusk, the brass reflectors are turned toward the setting sun to gather what light they can. The evening keeper, young, impatient, takes over the flame. Cleon wipes his hands on his robe. He steps outside the tower, sits on a stone bench that faces the sea, and eats his supper. Flatbread olives, a wedge of dried fig. He shares the fig with Limos, and then, just before the stars rise, he writes one more line. Sea dark. Limos asleep. Wind steady from west. I feel a storm by morning. Then he sleeps, wrapped in linen, the murmur of waves far below. Not a hero, not a philosopher, just a man with a stylus and a tortoise. The storm came 3 mornings later. It wasn't dramatic, not by legend standards. No galleys shattered on the breakwater, no marble toppled from the tower, but it was enough to rattle shutters, swell the tides, and fog every window in the clerk's quarter for half a day. And Cleon, lighthouse keeper of little renown, had predicted it with nothing but a tortoise and the scent in the wind. The other keepers, those tasked with fire rotation and mirror maintenance, began referring to him half-jokingly as Cleon the Oracle. But he never claimed foresight. He just kept recording, quietly, continuously, even when there was nothing to report. Rain passed before dawn. Tortoise restless. Smoke from ships fell eastward. He had begun observing the smoke, how it rose, how it curved as a way to judge upper air pressure. Smoke over the outer docks rose thin and fast before a dry wind, but before humidity, it curled, hesitated, turned oddly blue. What started as idle observation slowly became method, one he never wrote down in full, but left threaded through hundreds of brief notations. Scholars, centuries later, would piece it together. A classicist named Dr. Alla Woffick in 1933 first noticed the repetition in phrase structure among lighthouse records attributed to Kay. She reconstructed a series of entries and argued in a lecture. that this keeper had developed a rudimentary protobarometric pattern recognition, a phrase which Cleon himself would have found ridiculous and charming. The storm was not his. By midsummer, a desert wind had begun blowing off the Libyan sands, curling around the delta and choking Alexandria in a yellow hush. Cleon noted how it deadened the usual gull calls, made even the palms seem tired. Wind dry, sand visible. In beamlight, tortoise unmoved. Harbor lanterns not visible by fourth watch. Then came the day of the THUNDERCLOUD. It gathered over the sea like an ink spill, slow and uncertain. The junior keepers thought it would pass. The guards at the harbor didn't even pause their dice games. But Cleon noticed something strange. The gulls flew in pairs, unusually low without crying. And Limos, his tortoise who had slept through entire weeks, before began pacing in small circles around the inner courtyard stone. He filed the entry with his usual calm. Gulls paired, air charged, tortoise agitated. Reflectors may fog if wind shifts. By nightfall, the harbor was lashed by heavy rain, so thick the torchlight on the far dock vanished. The next morning, Cleon helped bucket water out of the middle staircase. Two of the younger keepers were so impressed by his foresight they offered to bring him honey cakes from the bakery cart near the SERAPEUM. He accepted with quiet delight. But it was around this time something shifted. A new supervisor was appointed young, from the inland provinces, more interested in precision engineering than coastal moods. He declared that weather reporting shall be reduced to proper numerical entries, and began requiring all keepers to use standard military-style scrolls. For documentation, Cleon's style brief, poetic, personal, was deemed inefficient, and yet the new forms never quite captured the subtleties he recorded. Gull patterns, tortoise behavior, the smell of iron in the air. So Cleon did what many silent dissidents have done in history. He complied outwardly and continued his real work elsewhere. He began writing 2 versions of each day's record. The official version, structured, clipped, lifeless, and his own, tied with blue twine, stored behind a loose stone in the tower's south alcove. These hidden scrolls were found centuries later, rolled with lavender leaves and sea-worn twine. They smell faintly of salt and beeswax. One of the more famous scrolls reads, "Storm came gently, rain with no wind. Sea breathed evenly. Limos curled against the lamp base. I did not feel alone." He was in his 60s now. No apprentices, no family nearby. But the flame still needed tending. The tortoise still needed feeding. And the sea, wide and changing, still needed someone to notice the way it moved. It is easy to imagine him watching from the parapet, robe tugged by the wind, wax tablet warm from the sun. He doesn't see himself as a scholar, only a scribe of patterns. And yet, this quiet manner named in temple rolls, absent from any statue, would go on to shape how later coastal watchers wrote their own notes. In Roman maritime manuals from 3 centuries later, one finds odd phrases, bird pairings, tortoise pace, smoke shape before fog, all suspiciously Cleon-like. It's unclear if any of those later watchmen ever knew his name, but his rhythm remained. His observations, like the lighthouse beam, circled long after he was gone. The winds did not remember his face. The sea did not remember his voice. But the tower remembered, because the tower was built to catch light, and Cleon's light was the quiet kind. By the time Cleon turned 70, the steps inside the Pharos felt longer. The central spiral, The grand ascending ramp that circled the belly of the tower now took him to rest breaks to climb. His knees, once as steady as carved stone, began to hesitate, especially when the sea air turned cold. He never complained. Not once. Instead, he adjusted his schedule, rising earlier than the others so he could reach the middle terrace by first light, as he always had. 2 goals today. Limos sluggish, air thin but dry. Took longer to reach mirror level. Even his reports noted the passing of time. The younger keepers began calling him Grandfather Feroz, partly in jest, partly in awe. Some of them had never known a day without him. They would ask questions he'd already answered many times before, but he never scolded. He simply smiled, passed them a sheet of scrap papyrus, and said, "Write it down. You'll forget otherwise." Not all of them took his advice, but one did. Her name was Ione. She had joined the lighthouse crew at age 19, assigned first to mirror polishing and later to tower signal duties. She was the first in years to ask Clea not just what he observed, but why the tortoise? She asked, "Because he notices what I don't," Cleon answered. "And the birds, they change when the air changes. And they don't lie." Ione began sitting beside him during lunch breaks. At first, she asked questions. Then, she started bringing her own wax tablet. No gulls, limos, restless. Cleanne says the sea is brooding again. It became a kind of mentorship, though Cleanne never called it that. He simply offered quiet guidance, as he always had. Eventually, Ione became the only other keeper who knew about the drawer in the south alcove. At first, Cleon had been reluctant to show her. That drawer, half hidden behind a notch in the stonework, held decades of his private scrolls, all tied neatly with blue thread. Some were weather reports. Others were stray observations, odd notes, even tiny poems. Sea green, sky bruised, tortoise unimpressed. The mirror caught a bird's reflection. It stayed with me. One day, Ione asked what he wanted done with the drawer if something were to happen. He smiled at that, not sadly, but with the peace of someone who had asked himself the same question many times before. "Don't burn it," he said. "But don't worry if no one reads it either." Ione disagreed, quietly, firmly. So she began copying pieces of the archive in her own spare scrolls. She added her own observations, weaving them in with Cleon's, like a second voice in a duet that neither expected would be heard. And then, one winter evening, Cleon didn't descend the stairs. The junior keeper on the night shift assumed he'd fallen asleep near the parapet. But when dawn came and the flame had not been stoked, they climbed. They found him sitting on the eastern ledge, back straight, eyes closed. The tortoise, Limos, rested beside him under a fold of his robe. He had passed quietly in his sleep. On the wax tablet beside him were just 3 words: no wind, peaceful. Ione took care of the rites. There was no statue, no epitaph. But inside the lighthouse, the keepers carved a simple note onto the wooden drawer's lid: Cleon, Watcher of Winds. The scrolls stayed hidden for generations. Some were lost in fires. Some were rescued during a later restoration and archived by scribes who didn't know who Kate was. But a handful made their way into Alexandria's shrinking libraries, and then centuries later into the hands of researchers who puzzled over the quiet, lyrical voice in them. They had no idea that many of the metaphors they'd come to think of as typical early nautical phrasing, phrases like the sky listening, or the wind thinks, or gull silence before the fog, had begun with a tired old man, a wax tablet, and a tortoise who liked cucumbers, Limos lived on for a time. He was passed down to Ione, and then to another keeper after her. Eventually, he too passed, and was buried near the southern wall with a note. He kept time better than we did. But the practice remained, even as later generations embraced engineering and astronomy, and lighthouse operations grew more formal and mechanical. There was always at least one keeper who still recorded strange things: the scent of the sea at dawn, the sound of gulls on silent days, the slow motion of clouds over the harbor. Cleon's influence, it turned out, was not in discovery or design. It was in attention. He noticed the world gently, and he taught others to do the same. In the end, the Pharos was toppled by earthquakes. The drawer vanished into dust, but a few lines remained, copied and recopied in old weather logs. Inscribed in marginalia, passed from observer to observer, long after his name was forgotten. And if you sit by the sea today, and feel the wind change, and find yourself wondering whether it smells of copper, or pollen, or rain, well, you are part of his story too. Because Cleon never meant to be remembered. He just wanted someone to notice. In the year 1287, in a Benedictine convent nestled near the banks of the Weser River, Sister Apollonia began noticing the moon. She did not intend to become an expert on it. She was not a scholar. She was the keeper of candles. It was her duty to trim the wax tapers in the scriptorium, refill oil lamps in the prayer stalls, and measure wick length according to the season. But it was during one winter vigil, when she noticed the moonlight pouring through the frost glass window, that something began to click. In her mind, candle burns slower in moonlight. She wrote in the margin of her wax tablet, "Could be my mistake. Test again tomorrow." No one else in the convent noticed the pattern. Most of the sisters were focused on psalms and linen repair. But Apollonia had a habit of waking just before the others, padding through the halls, on slippered feet, checking the angle of the moonlight against the refectory walls. She started keeping 2 logs, one for oil, one for moonlight. At first, they were simple, moon high. Oil lasted longer. Candles did not drip. No moon, cold air. Wax melted unevenly. Flame leaned west. Then she began to correlate wax behavior with moon phase, sleep. Depth judged by how often she woke with the moon's brightness. The mood in the chapel. The dryness of ink in the quills. And finally, she began recording something peculiar. Dream vividness. She never shared this log with the abbess. It felt private, even experimental. But her notes from 1289 include phrases like dreamt of, bees, full moon, no dreams, new moon, Sister Judith, restless, everyone silent at breakfast, moon half shaded. Ink did not dry by Lords. The convent ran by canonical hours matins, Lords prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers. But Apollonia noticed that her own internal clock seemed increasingly aligned to the lunar rhythm, not the bell. She would rise without reason at the same hour each waning crescent, even if the bell had not rung. She once caught herself pouring lamp oil at exactly the moment the moon touched the refectory arch. Eventually, she wrote in her notes, "I think my body hears the moon." This was not considered doctrine, but it was not quite heresy either. And because Apollonia never claimed it as truth, only as observation, she was never rebuked. She also never preached it. She simply adjusted her candle schedule. Candles to be trimmed more often on waxing moons, oil to be reserved during waning, and sleep whenever possible to be deepened during the dark moons. When the night was truly dark, She even began suggesting to the other sisters that they sleep in shifts depending on moonlight. At first, they resisted, but over time, they began to notice those on moonlit watch hours reported more dreams, more agitation. Those assigned to darker hours slept deeper. So she built a chart, drawn on a vellum scrap with faded blue ink. It contained phases of the moon sleep intensity logs, hers and the sisters'. Candle burn, rate soon, explained emotional notes like sister. Agnes wept for no reason. Wax pooled strangely. No one had asked her to build a sleep calendar, but she did, and in 1291, she quietly stitched it into the cover of the convent's gardening book, where no one would think to look. The vellum chart might have stayed hidden forever, pressed between instructions for pruning gooseberries and rotating turnip beds, had it not been for a visiting monk named Brother Matteo. He had been sent from Rome to copy medical herbals, and was, by all accounts, rather bored. The convent's collection leaned toward the practical rashes, chilblains, nettle tea for melancholy, not exactly the celestial texts he preferred. Then one rainy afternoon, while thumbing absent-mindedly through the gardening volume, he noticed something unusual: a stitched-in leaf of parchment with neat, looping letters and a strange spiral of symbols, moons, flames, and what appeared to be sleep notations. The title, in small, careful Latin, read, "Observations on Lunar Influence upon Candle Wax, Oil, and the Human Heart." No name, no formal claim, just dates, patterns, and a month-by-month system for predicting what she called moonrest and dream pressure. Matteo was fascinated. He copied it, assuming it must be the work of some forgotten astronomer hidden among the convent's founding generation. He brought it back to Rome with the rest of his transcriptions, along with a few jars of pickled beets and a page of goat cheese tips. The chart was filed, forgotten again for a few years, until it landed on the desk of a cleric who dabbled in lunar medicine, and so, over the next 2 decades, Sister Apollonia's quiet schedule began making rounds in odd corners of the scholarly world. It was misunderstood almost immediately. A Dominican friar in Pisa declared it a manual for controlling dreams through moonlight. A medical scribe in Avignon tried to sell it as part of a sleep hygiene regimen involving cinnamon oil and sea sponges. By 1310, a traveling apothecary in Bruges claimed the method could cure toothaches if practiced with the right incense. None of these were true, but what remained, curiously, were her patterns. The wax rest nights, when candles pooled neatly and sisters dreamed deeply matched, more often than not, with new moons and low-tide cycles. Her waking moons, usually full moons with higher flexion hours, were correlated with fidgeting, vivid dreams, and notes like "dreamt of floating." All slept lightly. Agnes spilled the ink. By then, Apollonia was in her mid-50s. She had no idea that her notes had spread. No messenger arrived. No PayPal letter arrived at the convent gate, but the signs began to echo back. One morning, a traveling bookseller arrived with a crate of devotional guides. Tucked inside one was a folded parchment. Apollonia unfolded it. It was a chart, her chart, redrawn, labeled as Somnum Lunaris, a schedule for monastic serenity, and below it, derived from observations by an anonymous northern sister. She stared at it for a long time. Then she laughed, not because she was angry, but because she recognized her own handwriting, imperfectly copied, with small errors that only she would notice. The sisters watched her carefully that week. She seemed a little more tired, but also content. At dinner, she recited a proverb no one had heard before. The moon does not announce itself, it simply returns. And so she did what she always did. She continued observing. Her final notebooks, preserved now only in fragments, include entries where she began tracking cloud cover and how it interfered with the moon's effect. She suspected that not the moon itself, but its visibility, influenced the body's rhythm. Thick clouds, full moon, slept deeply. Clear skies, crescent moon, restless. Judith hummed in sleep. She also began crafting small diagrams of light and dark, overlaid with candles, oil pots, and sleep hours. She never shared them beyond the convent, but the sisters began referring to her privately as the keeper of rest. Not because she slept often, she rarely did, but because she seemed to understand rest in a way they didn't. By the year 1302, a few convents in northern Germany had adopted informal moon rest nights, where late-night prayers were moved. Earlier, during waning moons, the shift was subtle, never official, but it echoed something Apollonia had written long ago. Prayer is clearer when the body does not fight the night. In the convent's final records from the early 14th century, Sister Apollonia's name is written just once, barely a mention, in a ledger listing candle inventories. A short note says, Sister Apollonia, excused from morning service due to age, continues duties at night, still observes moon. She passed away quietly in the winter of 1305. No miracles were attributed to her. No canonization followed, but the younger sisters, especially those who'd once been assigned to her wax table or oil lamp duties, passed on stories they told of the moon chart hidden in the gardening book, of the gentle notes she left for those who couldn't sleep, of how she could tell when someone had dreamt something vivid just by looking at their face in the morning light. One of the sisters, Cicely, later wrote in a margin, when she looked at the moon, I felt calmer. She watched it the way others watched clocks. The moon continued, as it always does. Its phases kept marking the months. But centuries after Apollonia's death, something unusual began appearing in monastic guides across Europe. Small, quiet suggestions to adjust night prayers depending on the phase of the moon. In southern Italy, an abbey recommended longer services during waning crescents. In Wales, a convent moved matins slightly forward on the full moon. By the 1600s, moon-based temperance weeks were listed in handwritten calendars, though no one could quite agree on where the practice had started. And all the while, little phrases reappeared in unlikely places: wax rest, dream pressure, sleep dark, quiet moons. They slipped into the margins of herbals, calendars, letters between abbots. No one remembered Sister Apollonia's name, but her rhythm, that strange lunar cadence she'd once tracked with scraps of wax and oil, pots echoed on dot. By the time modern chronobiologists began studying circadian patterns, and the sleep labs of the 20th century discovered lunar correlations in human rest cycles, no one suspected a German nun had tracked something similar 7 centuries earlier. She had no charts of melatonin. She had no instruments beyond a taper and a window. And yet, when one researcher at the University of Heidelberg found an untranslated note in a 14th century sleep journal using the phrase somnum lunaris moonsleep, he was baffled. The note described full moon restlessness, the sensation of lighter dreams, and an unusual pattern of early waking. He assumed it was superstition, but at the very bottom of the note, in tiny Latin script, were 4 words, observed by the waxkeeper. And perhaps it's fitting that we still feel her rhythm, even now. That the full moon makes some of us stir in the night. that some of us sleep better during the new moon, when the sky is dark and the world is quiet. Perhaps this, too, is a kind of prayer, a quiet alignment with things older than clocks. And if, on some night when you wake for no reason, you find moonlight across your floor and wonder why now, you are not alone. You are part of the old schedule, the one stitched into a gardening book by a woman who simply paid attention. She never meant to be remembered. She just wanted us to notice. You are not the first to ride this path, nor will you be the last. There is no road here, not really. Two grooves pressed into the grass by centuries of hooves, wheels, and boots. The steppe stretches in every direction like an endless green sea, and above it, the sky is too wide to measure. No trees, no walls, no cities, but every 40 miles or so, there is a wooden post house, a gare, round and low like a puff of cloud, with a tethered relay horse and a pot already warming beside the fire. You don't stop long. You're part of the YAM, the sprawling Mongol communication system, stretched like a taut bowstring from Korea to Hungary, and you've got dried mutton in your pouch, and a skin of air-dried curd, and you can drink fermented mare's milk while riding at a full gallop. Not everyone can say that. The Mongol Empire was many things, brutally efficient, astonishingly well-organized, but for the messengers of the YAM, pronounced Zam, it was mostly a matter of not falling off your horse and not running out of cheese. The YAM system, begun under Genghis Khan and perfected by his successors, was a kind of medieval express mail network. Thousands of miles of relay stations were strewn across Asia, staffed by handlers, stocked with fresh horses, and most critically supplied with food. The job of the YAM rider was deceptively simple. Pick up a message, ride until you reached the next station, switch horses, eat if you must, ride again. Some riders could cover 200 miles in a single day, a staggering pace, made possible only by constant horse swaps and an almost monastic devotion to mobility. But the question remains, what on earth did they eat? There were no convenience stores on the steppe, no bakeries, no inns, no midnight kebab stands, and yet Mongol messengers traveled thousands of miles in every kind of weather, without complaint. The answer lies in what they carried: a small, pungent universe of preserved milk, dried meat, and wind-cured mystery foods called aruel in modern Mongolian. These were rock-hard pellets made from fermented milk, pressed into shapes and dried on rooftops or saddle straps. They were sour, crumbly, and nearly indestructible. Some were made from cow's milk, others from sheep or goat's butt for elite riders. The preferred source was mare's milk. Aruel had several advantages: lightweight and long-lasting, required no fire to prepare, doubled as toothbrush and snack sourness, kept you alert on long rides. A Mongol rider could keep a pouch of these strapped to his belt, popping one into his cheek like a lozenge. They softened with saliva and could last for hours. One traveler noted that the curds were so tough they could only be softened by the mouth of a man with strong teeth and no regard for flavor. Even Marco Polo, who had the manners of a curious guest but the palate of a Venetian noble, found them peculiar, though he admitted they were astonishingly practical. The Mongols did not salt their meat in the way Europeans did. Instead, they relied on wind-curing, a method that involved slicing mutton into long, thin ribbons and hanging them in the open air until they hardened. These strips, once dried, could be eaten as is, or boiled quickly into soup if you had access to hot water. The flavor, earthy, oily, intense. The fat content was high, which was deliberate. The steppe was cold, and fat meant fuel. A few strips could sustain a rider for a full day, especially if paired with curds or broth. One Persian chronicler described watching Mongol couriers eat their jerky as if it were fruit. He was politely horrified. Known as arag, this frothy, slightly alcoholic beverage was a staple in Mongol diets, not just for riders, but for nearly everyone on the steppe. Arag was made by pouring fresh mare's milk into a leather sack, often suspended from the doorway of a ger. The sack was then beaten, churned, and stirred sometimes hundreds of times per day until the milk fermented into a fizzy, tangy drink with roughly 2% alcohol for the yam messengers. Arag was rehydrating nutritious, full of proteins and probiotics ***, mildly intoxicating, but not enough to interfere with riding, often drunk directly from the skin while galloping. In fact, it was common for a rider to travel with a sloshing bag of arag strapped behind the saddle, the leather warming in the sun. A swig of mare's milk mid-ride was both hydration and morale boost. Foreigners were less enthusiastic. European ambassadors routinely gagged on their first sip, describing it as milk turned to lightning in the belly. But for the Mongols, it was the taste of home, besides aruel and arag. Mongols preserved nearly every part of milk. Aram clotted cream was dried into flakes. Suti salted milk tea could be made by melting dried milk cakes in hot water. Fried dough could occasionally be found at post stations, if the handlers had time to prepare it. But one of the more ingenious travel snacks was dried milk, skinned a thin, oily layer that forms atop boiled milk. This was skimmed, sun-dried, and folded into strips like parchment. Rich in fat, it could be chewed like gum or dissolved into soup. Butter was also packed into hide bags and sometimes consumed frozen, broken into chunks and sucked like ice cubes. The calories were dense, and the butter kept surprisingly well in the cold. Dry air in extreme conditions, say a relay station burned down by a rebellious lord, or a miscalculation left a rider days from food messengers, had one grim option: field butchery. Mongols were skilled at slaughtering their own animals, and riders were trained to take down a sheep or goat with minimal tools. In the most desperate cases, a rider could nick a vein in his horse's neck, collect a bowl of blood, and mix it with curd to drink as an emergency measure. This did not harm the horse permanently, and was seen as an honorable survival tactic, not cruelty. Bone soup could also be made by boiling even the smallest animal remnants in a skin bag over heated stones. The result was thin, but warm, and enough to keep a rider moving. So, what did Mongol messengers eat? They ate what traveled, what could be dried, hung, sucked, chewed, or dissolved. They ate what stayed edible for weeks in a leather pouch. They ate food that made sense only on horseback, under the open sky, where a fire might be scarce and speed was everything. And perhaps most importantly, they ate to endure. They did not dine, they did not feast, but they ate like the wind rides lean constant and without complaint by now. The rhythm of the ride is familiar. You gallop until your thighs ache, until your eyes water from the wind, until the blur of the steppe becomes a kind of trance. Then, over the rise, a post station, a squat circle of felt and smoke. A boy runs out with a fresh horse. You switch saddles, take a gulp of salted curd tea, and mount again before the steam has left your cloak. You have no map. You do not need one. You carry a passport that opens every door from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea, a worn, engraved tag hanging on a leather thong, a paisa, a badge of silver authority, and with it, the right to ride like thunder across the world in the 13th century. Long before visas and border checks, the Mongol Empire developed a tool of dazzling practicality and eerie modernity, the paisa. A paisa was a small metal tablet, gold, silver, or bronze, inscribed with an imperial decree and issued by the Khan himself or his close ministers. It was roughly palm-sized, shaped like a tag, and often bore the seal of the great Khan along with a short command: "Let no one hinder the bearer under heaven and earth by order of the Khan. Who obstructs this man shall answer to me." It was, in effect, a hall pass for the entire empire. Couriers who carried a paisa could requisition horses, food, shelter, and escorts anywhere along the Yam route. Refusing them was not only rude, it was treason. Station masters, innkeepers, local governors, even wandering monks were expected to obey the authority of the paisa. It turned the bearer into a moving outpost of the state. Some paisa were basic, others, reserved for imperial messengers, were works of art: silver, chased with falcons, gold with inlaid turquoise. Genghis Khan himself ordered that false paisa be punished by death. They were that powerful. The Mongol Yam was not just a string of posts. It was a system, arguably the most advanced logistical machine in the world until the Industrial Revolution at its peak. The Yam featured over 1,400 relay stations, more than 50,000 horses in rotation fresh, mounts every 25 to 40 miles, guard posts, supply depots, and pasture stationists, Yamchi, who acted as local administrators. The genius of the system was in its simplicity. Each post was responsible for maintaining a few things: a dozen or more horses, hay and dried animal for day, yurt or cabin with hot drinks and basic food, fuel, dung or wood for a cooking fire. Record of messengers who passed through every rider had a known origin and destination. Messages were sealed and stamped. Timetables were informal but enforced. Some stations were so remote that their only neighbors were herds of gazelles and hawks wheeling in the sky. And yet, the Yam worked. Letters could cross the empire in weeks, not months. Intelligence flowed from borders to court with unprecedented speed. Orders from the Khan reached governors in Samarkand, tax agents in Persia, and generals on the Danube in what felt like the blink of a steppe wind. The Yamchi were not messengers. They were caretakers, often former soldiers, local nomads, or even forcibly relocated Chinese or Persian administrators. Their job was to keep the station running quietly, smoothly, and without fuss. Their world was one of ledgers, leather, and logistics: grooming the horses, preparing, rations, tracking which messengers came through, and when hosting unexpected guests, envoys, missionaries, royal wives on tours. Sometimes a Yamchi went years without leaving his post, and yet he held enormous power. He could delay a rider, report misconduct, even withhold food if protocol wasn't followed. But to a man bearing a valid paisa, the Yamchi bowed low and offered his best horse. There are records of station masters who kept guest logs in Persian, Mongolian, and Syriac, offering tea to Nestorian monks one week and Mongol generals the next. It was, in its way, a sacred duty. The Yam was the Khan's voice, and the Yamchi made sure it never faltered, even with the Khan's seal and a pouch full of cheese. Being a messenger on the Yam was not exactly restful. There were in the borderlands of Georgia and the edge of the Rus. There were snowstorms that could strip flesh from bone. There were swollen rivers with no bridges, wolves with no fear of fire, and the ever-present danger of a horse going lame mid-relay. Messengers were trained to sleep in the saddle, Red Cloud, patterns and identify poisonous steppe herbs. Some carried small knives hidden in their boots, not for fighting but for cutting reins and fleeing if ambushed. They did not travel with escorts. The paisa was protection enough in theory, but the steppe was not always loyal. A misread tribal feud, a disgruntled noble, a hungry outpost. Even the fastest horse couldn't outrun politics. Still, the messengers rode. They rode through China, where silk banners fluttered above towns still marked with Mongol script. They rode through the forests of Siberia, where relay huts smelled of pine sap and boiling mare's milk. They rode across the baked plains of Persia, where old Zoroastrian temples cast long shadows over wind-worn paths, and everywhere, the silver glint of the paisa hung from their necks like a badge of fate. It's hard, from a modern perspective, to grasp just how unprecedented the Mongol communication system really was. In Europe at the time, messages traveled slowly and with great risk passed from merchant to monk, often delayed by war, weather, or disinterest. But under the yam, orders moved at 30 to 40 miles per hour. If uninterrupted wars were coordinated across thousands of miles, spies and scouts could relay intelligence within days. Foreign diplomats were watched, fed, and tracked. Even religious pilgrims used the routes. Paisa in hand, this velocity of information gave the Mongols their edge. It wasn't just cavalry and terror, it was paperwork, horses, and the ability to send a whisper across the world before the enemy heard the thunder. You ride until the sun slants low, amber light flooding the grasslands. A lone post appears on the horizon, smoke rising from its central hearth. The Yamchi stands ready. No words exchanged. He hands you a fresh mare. You nod, your saddle thuds into place. You take a last bite of dried curd. You grip the paisa, and without fanfare, you ride on. The message must reach Karakoram or Cairo. You don't remember anymore. You are the arrow. The road is your bow, and the wind your only companion. By the fourth day of the ride, you begin to dream with your eyes open. The steppe is a blur, green-brown waves shifting under an endless dome of sky. You don't stop to sleep. You don't truly wake. You simply continue in the saddle, your legs molded to the horse like another layer of hide. It is no longer day or night. It is only the ride. And for the Mongol messenger, this was the job. To keep going, regardless of sleep, comfort, or cold. To carry the Khan's word with such speed that armies could be raised before a rebellion reached its third breath. So how did they do it? How did these men, some barely older than boys, ride 200 miles in a day, eat standing, sleep in motion, and repeat the process for weeks? The answer is not magic. It's something far rarer: training, endurance, and an almost sacred sense of duty. It sounds like legend, but it's not. Contemporary accounts, Persian, Chinese, and even European, agree that seasoned Mongol messengers could sleep on horseback. This was not a full, deep sleep. Rather, it was a kind of half-conscious, trance-practiced state of relaxation, achieved through rhythmic motion, body memory, and, crucially, trust in the horse. Mongol horses, small and hardy, were trained from birth to read terrain. Their riders raised them from colthood, and the bond was profound. A good horse could find its way to the next station without guidance, especially if it had run the route before. So the rider, exhausted, wind-burned, hungry, would loosen the reins, lean slightly forward, and allow himself to doze in rhythm with the gallop. Some techniques made this easier. binding the ankles with rope or hide to keep balance. Using the tail strap, a Mongol innovation to stay anchored, tucking the chin into the chest to avoid snapping. Awake, a brief 10-minute nap at a trot could refresh a rider enough to continue for hours. One Persian diplomat, traveling under Mongol escort, wrote, "The man had not slept for a day and a night, and yet his eyes closed as he rode, and he remained upright, swaying like a stalk of grass in wind." Of course, not every sleep was in the saddle. The relay stations of the Yam were built with efficiency in mind, and many featured a small sleeping berth, often nothing more than felt and a low cot beside the fire. Messengers arriving at a post might sleep for 20 to 30 minutes, while a fresh horse was prepared, doze sitting up with a cup of butter tea in hand, take turns with a second rider. If the message was shared, but full night's sleep rare. Most messengers were trained to follow a cycle of micro rests, several 10 to 20-minute naps spread across the day and night. They didn't sleep like civilians. They slept like predators, light, brief, ready to wake with blade drawn. Their bodies adapted to this rhythm. It wasn't healthy, but it was sustainable for weeks at a time. And when the message was finally delivered, only then did the real sleep come. Deep, silent, sometimes for 12 hours, sometimes for a day. Then they saddled up again. Sleep deprivation alone wasn't enough to slow a Yam messenger. The Mongols understood endurance, and they knew how to feed it. Aside from dried curds and meat, the following were common fatigue fighters: salted milk tea sutei sai, a hot, briny brew made with brick tea, milk, and sometimes butter, drank by the bowlful. It warmed the gut and revived the senses. The salt helped retain water. The caffeine kept the eyes sharp. Kumis, airag, slightly alcoholic and effervescent. Fermented mare's milk had a curious, energizing effect. While not strong enough to intoxicate most Mongols, it created a gentle buzz, stimulating but not sedating. Fried dough pastries, sometimes sweetened with honey, portable, calorie-rich, and comforting. Even a hardened rider took solace in a piece of warm birdseg dipped in tea at a relay station. Fat pellets, chunks of sheep or goat fat, dried or frozen, eaten raw in cold weather. They were pure energy, no flavor, just fuel. Many messengers rode with a flask of broth tied to the saddle, still warm from the last post. A few sips of fatty soup could turn a dead-eyed stare into a renewed gallop. They didn't need pleasure in food. They needed momentum. Long-distance riders developed mental habits to stave off the creeping fog of exhaustion. Counting hoofbeats to stay alert, singing quietly into the wind to regulate breathing, visualizing the next post, like a lighthouse on the sea, telling themselves stories, memories of home, battles, or ghost tales. They had no books, no music, no distractions except the rhythm of gallop and grass. So the mind adapted. One account describes a rider who composed entire songs in his head during rides, then sang them aloud to postmasters as entertainment. The songs were never written down. They disappeared like dust in the wind. For the Mongol, this was natural. Life was motion. To stop was to sink. To rest too long was to vanish. Sometimes the body gave out. A rider might nod too deeply in the saddle and fall off, breaking ribs or worse. In cold weather, he might sleep at a post station and never wake, the frost claiming his lungs before dawn. There were tragic tales. Messengers found curled beside dead horses, still clutching their message pouches. There were also legends of ghost riders, still galloping across the steppe, visible only at duskmen, who never slept and never delivered. Their final order: the Mongols believed that dying on the road was not shameful. It was the price of service. The Khan's word was sacred. To carry it, even into death, was honorable. But most messengers survived, because they were young, they were trained, and they believed deeply in the machine of empire they served. What did a Mongol messenger dream of when he finally slept? Not palaces, not silks, not gold. He dreamed of fire, of a warm felt bed, of the weight of the pazer lifted from his chest, of a horse's breath, soft and steaming in the cold, of curds that didn't squeak in the teeth, of home, wherever that was. And then he woke to another message, another gallop, another day beneath the same eternal sky. There is no fanfare when he departs, no trumpets, no flags, just the gentle creak of a leather satchel and the cool click of the wheel that spins beside his right foot. He steps onto the Via Domitia, the oldest Roman road in Gaul, built long before he was born. It stretches east like a promise, 900 miles of stone and sun between his current post in Narbo, modern Narbonne, and Antioch, near the edge of Syria. He does not ride a horse that would throw off the mileage. He walks because he is a curator, Virum, a Roman road inspector, and the empire is his spreadsheet. While generals conquered and senators debated, it was the curators Virum, literally caretakers of the roads, who held the empire together. These men were part bureaucrat, part civil engineer, part long-distance hiker. Their role was to monitor, maintain, and standardize the great web of Roman roads. From the wind-blown coasts of Britannia to the hot stone valleys of Judea, they came from respectable but modest backgrounds, often equestrians, sometimes freedmen, occasionally army veterans. They were paid not for glory, but for precision. Each curator was responsible for a region. Some had teams. Others worked alone, with a servant or a local guide. But the job was always the same. Walk the road, measure the distances, inspect milestones and drainage note any needed repairs, log the width, gradient, surface wear, and bridge conditions, report it all back to Rome. It was, in short, glorified paperwork by foot. Tied to his belt, bouncing gently with every step, is the most important tool he carries. The hodometer. It looks like a spoked wheel on a stick, about the height of a shepherd's staff. With every revolution, it clicks, once, then again, and again. Inside, a gear mechanism counts the turns. Every 400 rotations marks 1 Roman mile, 1,000 paces, or roughly 4,800 feet. He listens for those clicks. He marks each one. In his left hand is a wax tablet, shielded by a leather flap. On it, using a bronze stylus, he scratches today's distances and notes. Second milestone, moderate rutting. Drainage channel, blocked. Local cattle crossing leaves, dung hazard. Third milestone missing, possibly buried by flood. Road width here narrower than regulation 8 Roman feet. Tally for complaint. Later, these quick notes will be rewritten, more cleanly in the office, perhaps copied onto papyrus for his regional magistrate. But for now, they are scrawled and dusty, like the roads themselves. He sleeps where he can, sometimes in mansionese, government rest stops, spaced every 5 to 5 miles along major roads. There, he may find a hot meal, a cot, even a bit of wine. Other nights, it's just the ground and a blanket, his back to a milestone and his head turned toward the stars. He eats what's local, bread and olives, in Italia lentils, and dried figs. in Greece, roast goat in Cilicia occasionally, spoiled fish in the backyards of creaky port towns. No one writes plays about curators virum, but they are always walking in the background of Roman life, unnoticed. Until something collapses. One writes in his log, "No bridge at Century had to ford knee-deep. Suggest stone footway for future." Another adds, in the margin, "Past. Funerary shrine shaped like lion, spooked donkey." These quiet details, unnoticed by the senators in Rome, are the heartbeat of an empire that prides itself on order. Every milestone is a contract with geography. If a milestone is off by even a tenth of a mile, it throws off postal schedules, tax assessments, and military deployments. It affects land surveys and legal boundaries. It even causes complaints from travelers using the itinerarium. Rome's early roadmaps, so the inspector's notes matter. They influence whether a bridge is rebuilt this year or next, whether a grain route is rerouted, whether a suspiciously slow courier is blamed or forgiven. The curator is not expected to fix things himself, but his measurements tell the fiscus imperial treasury where to send funds. A wrong number. It might mean a legionary outpost goes without grain for 2 weeks, or a provincial governor shows up at the wrong forum. In a world without GPS, spreadsheets, or satellites, the empire runs on footsteps and wax. His walk is long, and he sees things. A shrine to Mercury made of seashells. A roadside tavern with amphorae shaped like geese. A cart stuck in mud while its owner curses in 2 languages. A grave carved with the phrase, "He died while arguing over a toll fee." Each one he notes quietly, not always officially, but in the back of his wax tablet, there's a running log of curiosities and hazards. He sees temples being swallowed by vines. He passes soldiers marching west and priests walking east. He watches children play with slings in the shadow of broken aqueducts. He crosses regions where Latin is barely spoken anymore, and others where peasants recite Cicero by heart. He hears Egyptian, Gallic, Greek, and Armenian in the same market square. To inspect the roads is to walk the veins of Rome's body. And sometimes it doesn't feel like one body at all. Sometimes he stops, not for a rut, but for a debate. A farmer insists that a milestone is in the wrong spot. A merchant claims the road has narrowed due to a neighbor's encroachment. 2 villagers argue over whether a bridge belongs to one province or another. So he opens his codex, the official registry of Roman road surveys, and cross-references old measurements. Sometimes he sends word back to Rome for arbitration. Sometimes he marks the issue for resurvey. And sometimes he simply redraws the line, carves a quick tally into a replacement stone, and walks on dot. Not every milestone is made of marble. Some are just wood, or painted stone, or old broken altars repurposed with new distances etched in lime. A Roman road inspector doesn't just measure, he mediates the empire's memory as he nears the end of this month's circuit, approaching the outskirts of Antioch. He finds what he feared, a broken bridge, washed out by flood. He makes notes, sketches the remains in wax, and measures the detour. Bridge at Beloy collapsed. Temporary plank crossing in use. Dangerous after rain. Urgent repair suggested. He stops to drink from a spring, eats the last of his bread, and rests in a farmer's goat shed. Tomorrow he'll report to the local prefectus virum, dictating his findings while the scribe scratches away. Then he'll wait, maybe 2, 3 days while a new set of roads is assigned, because there's always another segment, Always another 300 miles to verify, another province to measure, another lost milestone to find beneath a fig tree. He has developed the habit of talking to stones, not dramatically, just to mutter under his breath as he passes each one, a faint nod of recognition, as if greeting old colleagues spaced out. Every 1,000 paces, they are everywhere. Milestones, miliaria, stand along the Roman roads like timekeepers in togas. Each one marks a full Roman mile from the point where a major road began, usually measured from a city gate, a forum, or even the golden milestone in the heart of Rome itself. For the curator, they are both friend and ledger. They help him verify his odometer's count, but they also tell him stories. Every one has a message. Each proper milestone bears an inscription. At minimum, it says the name of the emperor or the current local magistrate, the distance from the origin point, the name of the road. But many go further. They boast of who paid for the road, sometimes the Senate, sometimes a wealthy citizen eager for status. They note when repairs were last completed, sometimes down to the month. And some get deeply personal, listing the number of pavers used, or the cost in denarii, or even a dedication, built at his own expense by Lucius, Varius, Rufus, for the good of the Republic. Some curators take pride in beautifully carved inscriptions. Others groan when they find a local official has renamed a road, just to flatter the emperor again. There's one stone the inspector passed outside. Tarraco, that read, repaired under Tiberius Julius Priscus, procurator of Baetica on account of he wrote slipperiness twice in his wax notes and underlined it. The road was, indeed, comically slick, but not all milestones remain where they should. He keeps a tally for missing ones. Some are buried by landslides, some stolen by farmers, who think they make good gateposts, others toppled and dragged away by bored children, or worse, goats. One account describes a rider who composed entire songs in his head during rides, then sang them aloud to postmasters as entertainment. The songs were never written down. They disappeared like dust in the wind. For the Mongol, this was natural. Life was motion. To stop was to sink. To rest too long was to vanish. Sometimes the body gave out. A rider might nod too deeply in the saddle and fall off, breaking ribs or worse. In cold weather, he might sleep at a post station and never wake, the frost claiming his lungs before dawn. There were tragic tales. Messengers found curled beside dead horses, still clutching their message pouches. There were also legends of ghost riders, still galloping across the steppe, visible only at duskmen, who never slept and never delivered. Their final order, the Mongols believed that dying on the road was not shameful. It was the price of service. The Khan's word was sacred. To carry it, even into death, was honorable. But most messengers survived, because they were young, they were trained, and they believed deeply in the machine of empire they served. What did a Mongol messenger dream of when he finally slept? Not palaces, not silks, not gold. He dreamed of fire, of a warm felt bed, of the weight of the pazer lifted from his chest, of a horse's breath, soft and steaming in the cold, of curds that didn't squeak in the teeth, of home, wherever that was. And then he woke to another message, another gallop, another day beneath the same eternal sky. There is no fanfare when he departs, no trumpets, no flags, just the gentle creak of a leather satchel and the cool click of the wheel that spins beside his right foot. He steps onto the Via Domitia, the oldest Roman road in Gaul, built long before he was born. It stretches east like a promise, 900 miles of stone and sun between his current post in Narbo, modern Narbonne, and Antioch, near the edge of Syria. He does not ride a horse that would throw off the mileage. He walks because he is a curator, Virum, a Roman road inspector, and the empire is his spreadsheet. While generals conquered and senators debated, it was the curators Virum, literally caretakers of the roads, who held the empire together. These men were part bureaucrat, part civil engineer, part long-distance hiker. Their role was to monitor, maintain, and standardize the great web of Roman roads. From the wind-blown coasts of Britannia to the hot stone valleys of Judea, they came from respectable but modest backgrounds, often equestrians, sometimes freedmen, occasionally army veterans. They were paid not for glory, but for precision. Each curator was responsible for a region. Some had teams. Others worked alone, with a servant or a local guide. But the job was always the same. Walk the road, measure the distances, inspect milestones and drainage note any needed repairs, log the width, gradient, surface wear, and bridge conditions, report it all back to Rome. It was, in short, glorified paperwork by foot. Tied to his belt, bouncing gently with every step, is the most important tool he carries. The hodometer. It looks like a spoked wheel on a stick, about the height of a shepherd's staff. With every revolution, it clicks, once, then again, and again. Inside, a gear mechanism counts the turns. Every 400 rotations marks 1 Roman mile, 1,000 paces, or roughly 4,800 feet. He listens for those clicks. He marks each one. In his left hand is a wax tablet, shielded by a leather flap. On it, using a bronze stylus, he scratches today's distances and notes. Second milestone, moderate rutting. Drainage channel, blocked. Local cattle crossing leaves, dung hazard. Third milestone missing, possibly buried by flood. Road width here narrower than regulation 8 Roman feet. Tally for complaint. Later, these quick notes will be rewritten more cleanly in the office, perhaps copied onto papyrus for his regional magistrate. But for now, they are scrawled and dusty, like the roads themselves. He sleeps where he can, sometimes in mansionese, government rest stops, spaced every 5 to 5 miles along major roads. There, he may find a hot meal, a cot, even a bit of wine. Other nights, it's just the ground and a blanket, his back to a milestone and his head turned toward the stars. He eats what's local, bread and olives, in Italia lentils and dried figs. In Greece roast goat, in Cilicia occasionally. Spoiled fish in the backyards of creaky port towns. No one writes plays about curators Virum, but they are always walking in the background of Roman life, unnoticed. Until something collapses. One writes in his log, no bridge at century had to ford knee-deep. Suggest stone footway for future. Another adds, in the margin, past. Funerary shrine shaped like lion, spooked donkey. These quiet details, unnoticed by the senators in Rome, are the heartbeat of an empire that prides itself on order. Every milestone is a contract with geography. If a milestone is off by even a tenth of a mile, it throws off postal schedules, tax assessments, and military deployments. It affects land surveys and legal boundaries. It even causes complaints from travelers using the itinerarium. Rome's early road maps, so the inspector's notes matter. They influence whether a bridge is rebuilt this year or next, whether a grain route is rerouted, whether a suspiciously slow courier is blamed or forgiven. The curator is not expected to fix things himself, but his measurements tell the fiscus imperial treasury where to send funds. A wrong number. It might mean a legionary outpost goes without grain for 2 weeks, or a provincial governor shows up at the wrong forum. In a world without GPS, spreadsheets, or satellites, the empire runs on footsteps and wax. His walk is long, and he sees things. A shrine to Mercury made of seashells. A roadside tavern with amphorae shaped like geese. A cart stuck in mud while its owner curses in 2 languages. A grave carved with the phrase, "He died while arguing over a toll fee." Each one he notes quietly, not always officially, but in the back of his wax tablet, there's a running log of curiosities and hazards. He sees temples being swallowed by vines. He passes soldiers marching west and priests walking east. He watches children play with slings in the shadow of broken aqueducts. He crosses regions where Latin is barely spoken anymore, and others where peasants recite Cicero by heart. He hears Egyptian, Gallic, Greek, and Armenian in the same market square. To inspect the roads is to walk the veins of Rome's body. And sometimes it doesn't feel like one body at all. Sometimes he stops, not for a rut, but for a debate. A farmer insists that a milestone is in the wrong spot. A merchant claims the road has narrowed due to a neighbor's encroachment. 2 villagers argue over whether a bridge belongs to one province or another. So he opens his codex, the official registry of Roman road surveys, and cross-references old measurements. Sometimes he sends word back to Rome for arbitration. Sometimes he marks the issue for resurvey. And sometimes he simply redraws the line, carves a quick tally into a replacement stone, and walks on dot. Not every milestone is made of marble. Some are just wood, or painted stone, or old broken altars repurposed with new distances etched in lime. A Roman road inspector doesn't just measure, he mediates the empire's memory as he nears the end of this month's circuit, approaching the outskirts of Antioch. He finds what he feared, a broken bridge, washed out by flood. He makes notes, sketches the remains in wax, and measures the detour. Bridge at Beloy collapsed. Temporary plank crossing in use. Dangerous after rain. Urgent repair suggested. He stops to drink from a spring, eats the last of his bread, and rests in a farmer's goat shed. Tomorrow he'll report to the local prefectus virum, dictating his findings while the scribe scratches away. Then he'll wait, maybe 2, 3 days while a new set of roads is assigned, because there's always another segment, always another 300 miles to verify, another province to measure, another lost milestone to find beneath a fig tree. He has developed the habit of talking to stones, not dramatically, just to mutter under his breath as he passes each one, a faint nod of recognition, as if greeting old colleagues spaced out. Every 1,000 paces, they are everywhere. Milestones, miliaria, stand along the Roman roads like timekeepers in togas. Each one marks a full Roman mile from the point where a major road began, usually measured from a city gate, a forum, or even the golden milestone in the heart of Rome itself. For the curator, they are both friend and ledger. They help him verify his odometer's count, but they also tell him stories. Every one has a message. Each proper milestone bears an inscription. At minimum, it says the name of the emperor or the current local magistrate, the distance from the origin point, the name of the road. But many go further. They boast of who paid for the road, sometimes the Senate, sometimes a wealthy citizen eager for status. They note when repairs were last completed, sometimes down to the month. And some get deeply personal, listing the number of pavers used, or the cost in denarii, or even a dedication, built at his own expense by Lucius Varius Rufus for the good of the Republic. Some curators take pride in beautifully carved inscriptions. Others groan when they find a local official has renamed a road, just to flatter the emperor again. There's one stone the inspector passed outside. Tarraco, that read, repaired under Tiberius Julius Priscus, procurator of Baetica on account of He wrote slipperiness twice in his wax notes, and underlined it. The road was, indeed, comically slick, but not all milestones remain where they should. He keeps a tally for missing ones. Some are buried by landslides, some stolen by farmers, who think they make good gateposts, others toppled and dragged away by bored children, or worse, goats. The trickle of water down a drain pipe, the hiss of a brazier being snuffed out, laughter from an upper window, too high to worry about. He makes 3 dots on his wax slate. Routine. Aside from the lantern and the staff, the night watchman has a wax tablet to jot brief notes, say, cloth pouch of salt and chalk, used for marking gates quietly, salt for watch this house, chalk for check back later, a folded note with names of people who've recently made complaints, usually about neighbors being too noisy or too quiet, and his list of expected sounds, penned by the scribe of the ward supervisor, reads like a strange kind of poem. Whispers near bathhouse, permitted donkeys braying past 3rd hour, discouraged coughing in alleyways, note and revisit hammering, prohibited after 2nd bell, caged birds singing, permitted sudden silence in a place that was not silent. Investigate, he reads it every night. Like a ritual, the sounds of the caliph's capital are a world unto themselves. He hears the murmur of students in a rooftop madrasa, practicing verse by starlighty carpenters chisel tapping. He shouldn't be working, but he's fixing. A cradlely distant lute, soft and melancholic, someone playing to themselves on a terrace, the splash of a canal, goose. Every noise has a place. Every out-of-place sound is a kind of story. He must listen with curiosity, not suspicion. At one point, he hears a sharp clack, like metal tapping brick. He steps quietly, peers around a corner. Just a cat knocking over a pot lid. He leaves a bit of dried date by the wall as a truce offering. In most cities, you worry about thieves. In Baghdad, the watchman worries about scribes writing too late, tea sellers changing routes, and whether the man with the parrot has taught it new phrases that sound like arguments. He doesn't fear danger, he fears exceptions, because the night has its own rules, and the quiet ones break them most. It starts with a door, not just any door, a blue-painted arch behind the calligrapher's shop. He hears it open slowly, but there's no creak. It should creak, the hinges are dry. He made a note about them last week, but tonight, silence. Too silent. He makes a mark on his slate and sprinkles a dash of salt by the threshold. Not an accusation, just a reminder to observe. Next he hears a rooster. Odd, it's the middle of the night. Roosters don't crow unless they've been tricked by lamplight or fire. He glances toward the olive oil press and sees nothing, just smoke curling from a chimney, warm and lazy. He wonders, is someone working, cooking, or signaling? He decides to come back later, down a different lane. There lives a moneylender and his pet parrot. The parrot speaks in Arabic, Persian, and a bit of Greek every week. It learns something new. Tonight, as the watchman passes, The bird shrieks, "No, no, not tonight. The coins aren't yours." He stops. Did the parrot overhear something? Is it mimicking a crime? He knocks gently. The moneylender answers, yawning, with ink on his sleeves. "Sorry," the man says. "I dropped a tablet earlier. The bird's been repeating my scolding. Voice all evening." The watchman writes, "Parrot overheard argument. Not a cause for concern. Possibly better at his job than I am. There are people in the city who prefer the night. He meets them without speaking. A woman who washes parchment in canal water by starlight. A blind man who sharpens shears by sound alone. Scholar who walks the block backwards each night, reciting poems to keep his memory sharp. He makes no note of these people. They're part of the map now, expected, catalogued. The real danger is someone new, someone with no pattern. Once he heard nothing, and that was the problem. A bakery that always sang with furnace heat was quiet one night. He paused outside, expecting a sick baker or a holiday. Then he saw it, a rope hanging from the second-story window, trailing like a snake into the street. He slipped round back, peered through a ventilation slit, and saw a boy with a knife tiptoeing among the date cakes. He waited, didn't shout, just tapped his staff 3 times, a signal by morning. The baker had thanked him with a loaf of honeyed rye, and the boy had been apprenticed instead of punished. Sometimes mercy makes fewer sounds than justice. The city is large, but the night, he knows, is larger, because at night every alley stretches longer, every shadow grows fatter, and every footstep echoes as if it carries news from a distant province. The Abbasid night. Watchman does not need a map of Baghdad. He carries a map of sounds woven from footsteps, his and others. He doesn't count corners. He doesn't follow stars. He moves by the splash of water where a servant always dumps a bucket, the metallic ring where a horseshoe struck a cobble out of place, the whisper of silk slippers down a tiled corridor near the bathhouse, the soft rush of air where a tea-house door opens before dawn. Each sound is a kind of landmark, no less reliable than a milestone. Even the silences are signposts. There's a window shutter that always claps twice in the wind, but if it doesn't clap, he knows someone is home. Just before the call to prayer, the air thickens with stillness. Fewer sounds now, but he spots it. A narrow flame flickering behind a paper screen, low to the ground. That room should be dark. It belongs to a postal scribe, a man who never lights candles before dawn. He listens. No footsteps, no writing, no tea being poured, just the flicker. He leaves a single chalk circle beside the threshold and walks on. Tomorrow, he'll ask politely if all is well. That's how this job works. Not with arrests, with reminders. When the minaret's shadow thins, and the birds begin to murmur, the watchman knows his work is nearly done. He unlatches the horn lantern and lifts it high. The oil is nearly gone. Its final light falls on. Fisherman tying nets with sleepy hands, baker stoking the oven for first loaves, scholar in sandals, unrolling scrolls for morning study. He wipes his tablet clean and ties the staff to his sash. He makes one last note, a simple one, no events. All sounds accounted for. The city kept its peace. He walks home slowly, past the canals, past the lime trees, past the silent gates, and just before slipping inside, he hears a bird call, not a parrot this time, but a sparrow. He smiles, another. Night, fully heard. He wakes to the sound of water slapping the hull, soft and rhythmic, like a hand patting a drumskin. The outrigger canoe creaks gently in the swell. It's not small. This is no one-man vessel. It's a floating community, carved from breadfruit trees, lashed with coconut fiber, patched with barcloth and prayers. He is not alone. There are 9 people aboard, a live chicken, several bundles of smoked fish, a folded sail woven from leaves, and a long memory of where the stars rise. This is not an aimless journey. This is a science of listening, chewing, and reading clouds, birds, waves, and wind. Before departure, the oldest man on shore whispered to the hull, not a prayer, a greeting. You speak to the canoe because it has memory carved into its spine, softened by salt and time. Each part has a name, the timu, the forward tip, where offerings are tied to the kiato, the arms that link the main hull to the outrigger, the hull back which they never sit on. With wet feet it's rude to ancestors. They call the boat by a woman's name, not spoken aloud until land is reached. The boy who tied the lashings still smells of camphor and ash. His knots hold the shape of the journey itself. There is no cooking fire aboard. It's taboo instead. Food comes from baskets lined with leaves, breadfruit, roasted ashore and sliced into quarters, dried octopus, chewy and smoky, eaten with salt and a squeeze of sour tamarind sago cakes, wrapped in palm and softened in seawater, and, once a day, a small handful of grated coconut sweetened with banana to drink. They pass around a gourd of fermented pandanus juice, fizzy and faintly tart. Meals are quiet, deliberate. You must chew slowly, not just for digestion, but because a navigator must keep the mouth clean and moist. Why? Because to chart stars, you may need to hold a piece of chewed charcoal on your tongue. At night, the navigator sits cross-legged at the front, eyes half closed. He dips a fingertip in water and holds it to the wind. He places a black mark on his tongue, made of crushed charcoal and burnt shell, not for tasting, but for sensation. It sharpens the awareness. Then he watches the horizon, not for shapes, for emptiness, the shape of the night sky above a gap in the clouds. He whispers, the canoe of Orion is rising. The shark star follows, tilt west. He does not look down at maps. The maps are inside his body. A push of the heel means turn left. A tap on the mast means trim sail. The canoe shifts smooth as breath and continues across water that remembers every island, even if humans forget.